All right, looks like we're all ready to go. Mr. Chair, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Well, I'd like to welcome, call the meeting to order and welcome everyone. And in accordance.
Sorry, hold on really.
Pardon?
We're still in practice mode.
Sorry about that. I give me a moment for the attendees to come in. It looks like we're all ready to go. Oh, that's me. All right. I think we're ready to go.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to call the meeting to order, the meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board, and in accordance with the federal, state, and local guidelines to protect public health and safety in response to COVID, this meeting will be conducted entirely via remote access. We welcome written questions and comments, and please email your comments to DISB at deltacouncil.ca.gov as on the screen. And in your request, indicate which agenda item you would like to have a public comment read. If you prefer an oral comment, please use the raise hand function or send an email. And then afterwards, wait till you're prompted to speak and then provide your name and affiliation before you speak. So that's the introduction. I'd like to start off with a roll call and have each of the members state their name and whether or not they have any new declarations since the last meeting. Steve Brandt, no new declarations. Jay?
I do declare no new declarations.
Jim?
Jim Cloran, no new declarations.
Virginia?
No new declarations.
Joe?
No new declarations.
Tanya?
Tanya Heikela, no new declarations.
Tom?
Tom Holzer, no new declarations.
And Diane, are you there yet? Okay, and Bob Nyman, I do not believe is going to make it today. And Lisa?
Lisa Winger, no new declarations.
Okay, so we have 8 present, so we do have a quorum. Today's agenda just is really one topic, and that's we're going to talk about our work plan and future direction and how we're going to set up kind of the rest of the year. And before we dive into that, are there any public comments yet, Edmund?
There are none.
Okay, move on to our one and only topic for today is to really look at our work plan and sort of the future direction where we might go. And prior to the meeting, you should have gotten the draft work plan options, but I'm going to give a presentation and talk about our work plan and make a suggestion. Dan, welcome. Do you have any new declarations?
No, I have no new declarations, and I apologize for being a few minutes late.
No problem. You haven't missed anything. So I think, we've now had with the new board members here a handful of months to get oriented and to think about the reviews. We've talked about each of the reviews we're doing, but I think it's time to really kind of take stock and get an estimate of where we are, where we're going over the next year, and lay out a plan so that we can all prioritize our time and so forth. And one of the jobs of the incoming chair, and I still am an incoming chair, is to identify, and I'm reading out of our guidance lines, is to identify one or more primary issues to focus on during their term. And what I'd like to do today is to kind of propose something in a way of going about it, but it's only a proposal and a way to think about it. So I'm going to start off with some background and talk about my proposal, and then open it to the floor and let the board as a board really decide where they want to go and what they want to do. So don't consider this as any kind of a dictate from the chair. It's actually just my way of suggesting here's where I think might be a valuable approach, which I think will accomplish a number of different kind of things we've kind of already talked about. So I'm going to start off with a presentation. And Edmund, you want to put up the first slide? I'm going to give about a 15-minute presentation and on some background and things, and then open the rest of the discussion for the next hour and a half to a discussion. I really appreciate Edmund helping this, putting together this presentation. I literally started working on this over the last day or so. So yesterday it was back and forth and alternating things, and Edmund responding and putting together a really nice looking presentation when I sent him a few texts on emails. So I really want to thank him for his help in this. Let me start with the next slide, which is kind of a background, just to remind folks what we're supposed to be doing. We actually have a fairly broad mandate, and all of the words I've shown in the next couple of slides are taken directly out of our approved guidelines. And but I pulled out some things, not all the things, but I pulled out some things that kind of relate to what I'm going to propose to do. You know, these are what our requirements are, is to provide oversight of scientific research, monitoring, and assessment programs that support adaptive management of the Delta through periodic reviews of each of those programs. What we have done on that is largely gone towards the writing thematic reviews, topical reviews on subjects, rather than looking at very specific programs. The word oversight is a word I looked up in the dictionary, and it covers a fairly broad perspective, particularly when you talk about scientific oversight. A big part of scientific oversight, as anyone who's ever led a lab or a center, is to set out strategic priorities. What are the priorities for the future? Where do we need to go? Kinds of things. It's not strictly looking at things you've done and evaluating them. It's a forward-looking thing. And that'll be the theme of what I'm talking about. We're required in the second bullet there to submit to the council a report of the results of each review, including recommendations for changes in the programs reviewed, and then also to provide independent advice on the Delta plan. The next slide. The Delta Stewardship Council also gave us a charge, some specific charges. And Edmund put this photo in here, which I think is, for the new members, this is the way we would normally operate. We actually talk and look at each other and get a chance to meet and in a public forum. So hopefully we will get back to that. The broad Delta Stewardship charge to the DISB was stated as the overall objective of the Delta ISB oversight is to help make the science underlying the Delta programs, the application of the science, and the technical aspects of those programs the best that they can be. So really our role can be looked at is that what can we do to improve the scientific, the science in the Delta and the applicability of that science to management questions. You know, it's a fairly broad mandate. The next slide specifically points out, and these are photos, by the way, of some of the field trips we have taken into the Delta, points out some additional responsibilities. And one is to understand the technical underpinnings of Delta science programs and plans. That's fairly basic. We really need to know what is going on and what's the science of the Delta. Second bullet, regularly evaluate the science agenda for the Delta, and I highlighted this section, provide evaluation of the implementation of a strategic, balanced, and proactive science agenda across Delta programs. That proactive science agenda is really the theme I'll be talking about in terms of what I'm going to propose. Thirdly is to review the balance and credibility of the scientific analysis and syntheses. Syntheses is also an important word there. And also to identify emerging issues and significant interconnections among Delta programs. So one could read this as we need to evaluate, look forward, evaluate the proactive science agenda, look at the what might be emerging issues, and also the potential for interconnections among science programs. The next slide. Now, this is our normal way of looking at sort of a tabular view of our work plan. Let me walk through this a little bit. On the left column is the top 4 things are what we might call our current reviews that we have underway. And then, of course, across the calendar, we will be asked to look at the science action agenda sometime in the fall. And then what I'm going to propose is explore forward-looking, some forward-looking science for the entire year. Now, and then other requests, we may or may not get other requests coming to us from the council. I'm not aware of any, and they told us last meeting that they didn't anticipate any coming down over the next 12 months. Now, at first look, this may look like, wow, we are really busy and every single month is covered with a lot of things to do. But in reality, I think you have to look at this as this is the compilation of activities of the board members as well as the staff, and sort of how long we might expect it to take. Some of these things, when you zero in and look at what individual or board members are doing, or groups, or the entire board itself, it's a lot less effort than is anticipated shows here. And I can look at this water supply reliability. You see there's a 2-month section in there on public comments on the draft report. We do nothing during that time. We send it out, it goes out for report for a period of 2 months, and then it comes back. And then usually, as shown here over 4 months, is it goes back to the writing team. So if you're not on the writing team, you still, you may look at the public comments and come in, it's revised, and then it'll come back sometime during that June through September period for an evaluation of all board members. So the activity of all board members is only ignited when that revision comes back, or possibly looking at the comments of public comments in the context is that revision. And I think if you go down to the DPIC meeting, science needs assessment, there's a whole 5 months plan for outreach and implementation support. And that may be very simply just putting together a 2-pager, and some people doing, along with others, either making a presentation or talking to individual agency heads and so forth. So on the one hand, it looks like certainly these will be active reviews probably over the course of the time frame shown here. But the actual activity level of board members, in my view, and does not cover all of that time. And some individuals, particularly the writing team, do are active during some of these blocks of time. Other times they're not really active. The rest of the board is not active on those. So this is the assumption under our present staffing level, under our present board level, and of level activities. Now, I think I told you a meeting or two ago that we made a request to hire 2 postdoctoral scholars. We believe we have approval for those. We are in the process of putting together a job description. There will need to be a contract so the actual start date of those positions are still open, but that will be a significant increase in the level of sort of high level support that we get. And I expect that some of the things that these postdoctoral scholars would do are literature reviews, syntheses, presentations, development, both in local, but also in national and regional meetings, analyses of surveys, analyses of inventories, and possibly publications. Sort of a whole lot of things that would very likely, once they are on board, shorten the time frames for some of these activities. So does anybody have any questions in particular on this before I move on, just on the reviews and what these things might mean?
I have a question. question about the postdocs. Would they be supervised? How would that structure work in terms of assignments and working together? And they,
It depends. We're looking at two different entities in order to make the subcontract to. And their official supervisor of record would belong to one of those two agencies. The plan here is that they would be mentored by the science chair or someone who's in charge of one of these groups. So but the science chair would be the nominal mentor. So in other words, it's my expectation that we would assign their full slate of cards, a slate of activities, but they would need to be under a mentorship. They would develop, as most postdocs, sort of a individual development plan where you scope out where they, what activities and they could do to enhance their career. And that would be the publication, national and international presentation kinds of activities. And we want to make sure that they get something out of this from a real professional development, postdoctoral kind of level point of view. And that would be something that we would make sure that I say we, the board, but probably certainly the chair's responsibility, and perhaps one or more others. If we assign one, for example, whose primary responsibilities is to either, let's say, do the forward-looking stuff, then who's ever in charge of that group might be the mentor to do that. That's sort of what we're looking at now. We're looking at 2-year appointments. Some of this stuff is still a little fuzzy, but that we're in the process of developing that. And frankly, at the end of this, today's discussion would hopefully provide us enough information to secure a better description of what those jobs would be.
thanks.
Anything else? Okay, let's move on. The next slide.
Well, Steve, just to point out, if the board members aren't already aware, we've had a fair variety of different ways of doing reports, doing reviews. Some of them have been write-ups of workshops. Some have turned into essentially journal papers. Some have been fairly long. Many have been moderately short. So I think we actually have quite a lot of flexibility as to what the format and what the content is of these reviews and how they're conducted.
That's a very good point, Jay. And I've been talking to Lauren Hastings a little bit in terms of she's done that. She's in the process of doing surveys and looking at our reviews and the effectiveness of our reviews and so forth. And one of the recommendations, and I told her I wouldn't quote her, so I'm not quoting her, but one of the themes that we've heard from the very beginning is to enhance sort of the outreach and communication aspect of our reviews. And I think that this is certainly an area where postdoctoral scholar activity, particularly in terms of publications, helping with publications, although many board members are probably interested in that as well as presentations and a variety of things like that. So in enhancing the outreach and communication endpoints, I think is an important component of, and then there's some front end stuff as well that we could perhaps look at how we do that. So she expects to have that report out to us in hopefully in March. And by then that will help us, particularly in the current reviews and certainly in any new reviews we plan to undertake. This is a list of our current writing teams, just in case you don't forget. And so these are the writing teams for the current 4 reviews that we have underway right now. And that includes 6 of the 10 board members, not to suggest that those who aren't on a writing team won't be called on, but they probably will be called on. So if I can go to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about where we want to go from here. Part A on the left is the completion of the ongoing work and project. Clearly, I can't see any argument not to complete that work. The time scales we laid out are estimates. They can go at a much faster time frame if we get some additional help. They may go at a slower time frame depending on just how things evolve over time. In my view, that leaves a lot of board time available, and even under the present circumstances. So one option is, well, other activities, we do nothing. We just focus on the completing the work we're undergoing, and that's all we do for the rest of the year. I really think that's will leave a lot of open time for board members. I don't think that's the right approach to go, and I'm going to suggest we add something. Another option is to pick one or two reviews and get started. We have a lot of ways to pick those reviews. We have a July report out where we did a survey, and I think we have at least a dozen different review topics listed in there. And we can just move forward. I'm going to propose something a little bit different, and that's to do some forward-thinking exploration along the concept of forecasting. I'll spend the rest of my time explaining what I mean by that. I think the approach I'm going to suggest also does the job of exploring the possibilities for new reviews. It does a more depth review, look at some topics. So it will actually begin some of those reviews in an exploratory fashion. I think it also is a way to provide sort of educational opportunities for all the members of the board on some of the fundamental key issues in the Delta. I think it would be useful, as we've seen in some of the discussion groups we've already held, having those kind of discussions focused in on a topic and finding a background, talking about the science is a good way to help educate all of the board members on some of the key management issues facing the board. And then I also think this approach provides some products itself that would be valuable to the board and its overall oversight and input to agencies on the science. Next slide. Okay, we have a lot of material already developed, and so the ideas I'm presenting are not necessarily new. Of course, we have the Bay Delta Science reports, the Delta Science Plan, Science Action Agenda. There's actually something that was done, a visionary thing done back in 2016, I believe, on Fast Forward Delta. More recently, though, if you look at the lower left is a memo we wrote to DPIC summarizing some of the panels and so forth we had on thinking about a rapid changing or a changing environment and the recommendations in those. We have a rapid response paper that we've been working on and a white paper that you've seen. We have our July 30th white paper that you've seen a copy of, which is where we've done an assessment of what some of the emerging review themes might mean. And we also have a science needs assessment that you've seen the draft of and commented on the actual recommendations at our last meeting. And we also have the lead scientist, Laurel's presentation of where she thinks the science program is going. Where I'm taking these ideas from are largely from the science needs assessment, but it really does encompass the recommendations in the future science reviews, the preparing for a fast forward future, and the recommendations on interagency activity that we made to Delta program. And also links very nicely, I think, with Laurel's goals for the program. So the next slide. Now, our memo to the council on April 13th of this year, last year, were, again, one of the things we said is we indicate that the Delta science and management needs to employ existing methodologies and develop new ones for looking ahead to anticipate changes and thresholds. Again, that looking forward sort of thing. We talked about enhancing the resilience of systems, but we also suggested undertaking scenario analyses, horizon scanning by interdisciplinary teams to better foresee future directions. Well, our board's an interdisciplinary team, I think. We suggested eliciting the judgment of experts from multiple disciplines. I don't know if we're experts, but we certainly have multiple disciplines. So this is something we as a board could begin to take on. We suggested focusing science more directly on foreseeable management needs. Again, the future aspiration, a future look, and the accelerating the synthesis. Synthesis and communication is a part of the effort. The next slide. This is Laurel, a slide taken out of Laurel's presentation last week about her vision for the Delta Science program. And again, her work, she wants to work with us on promoting convergent forward-thinking practices. So I think it fits nicely, and I won't redo her presentation, but it fits very nicely in what her proposals were. Okay, the next slide. Now, and I will eventually get to what I'm proposing. I'm just providing a lot of background of where these ideas came from. The science needs assessment, this is a thing the board more or less adopted at the last meeting, was the recommendation of the science needs assessment to use forecasting as a focus for organizing multiple agency in science integration. Now, certainly a forecasting approach and forecasting tools and forecasting capabilities really improves management decision and reducing risk. And I've always used the weather example it's the fact that it's snowing here today. You can give me a lot of science to explain why it snowed today, but it doesn't help me in making any decisions. But if you give me a tool that says it's going to snow tomorrow and with a certain probability, and it might in the future with different probabilities, that's clearly a decision-making tool that's valuable and can reduce risks. All of these sorts of forecasts require interagency science collaboration, requires identification of needs and gaps in our understanding of the processes themselves, requires modeling frameworks. It also allows one to prioritize monitoring at appropriate time and space scales. You need the monitoring data to feed forecast models and also to test them. And it might help develop scientific insights, span the missions of several agencies, and improve policy and management discussions. These are taken right out of the science needs assessment. These are the exact words in that current version of the scientific needs assessment. Next slide. So when you think about using forecasting, forecasting can be made across a very wide range of types of forecasts. Invasives, water quality, forecast of water quantity, fisheries, physics or hazards, and human health. We talked about harmful algal blooms the other day. That's clearly an example of perhaps a human health issue related to forecasting. In terms of, we're always interested in fisheries, being able to forecast the fish production and recruitment based on management decisions. How well will it do? Water quantity, as Jay has talked about many times, is clearly an area where having the ability to forecast what that might be in the short and long term is an important thing. So these are sort of a general examples of that. And I've said it by its very nature allows one to requires multiple agency and multiple disciplines to work together. And the next slide, just as an example of a harmful algal blooms. We heard a couple of meetings ago, I think, about harmful algal blooms and the value it has. But if you really want to be able to forecast a harmful algal bloom in a general sense, it depends on things like rainfall and meteorology, which then drives the water, and the hydrology and the water flow and nutrient loadings, which then drives moves around, so circulation, transport, and fate. There's biological things that happen, and you eventually get a harmful algal bloom, and that can provide information. All of this can provide information again on how changes in land use, as one example, might affect that nutrient loading, water flow, water management. So it requires forecasting at each of these interfaces, and you may have people that are studying hydrology to a great extent, but to then translate that into be able to forecast harmful algal blooms requires that interdisciplinary connections and linkages. And there's no one discipline that can make these forecasts. So go to the next slide. How you do a forecast is kind of shown in this diagram here. Now, a critical step in the process, which I think we would need to take, is to look at stakeholder and management needs assessment, that top box there. The question here is, why is this important? What do managers need to know? What's important for them to be able to have predicted for them, and at what time and space scales? You know, management comes in at that very first stage, management and stakeholder needs, as what do I need to know? And that's very important for going back to the rain and snow example again. You know, I need to know what the probability of snow forecast is 2 days from now. And I don't need to know it 6 minutes from now, you know, and I don't need to know it from yesterday. I need to know, and I don't need to know necessarily to make a management decision if it's going to snow in Wisconsin today. You know, I need to know if it's going to snow in Oregon today, in my area. So it defines the time and space scales, it defines the parameter scales, but I also don't need to know the atmospheric pressure, you know, to make a decision. The meteorologists need to know atmospheric pressure in order to make the forecast. It's very important, but it's not something that a manager or me as an individual really need to know in order to make my decision about what I'm going to do. So a lot of the components that go into this are valuable to make that, some more valuable than others to make those kind of things, but managers decide what the ultimate product is going to be. What is the actual thing I need to know? Then scientists come in and say, okay, given that you want to know, let's say, harmful algal blooms on a forecast that on a daily basis on a 1 kilometer square, whatever, spatial scale, what kind of science do we need to be able to make that forecast? And the scientists can put together the model and make that forecast. Then it links to the monitoring programs by, again, providing the necessary, do we have the necessary input for those models, and do we have the necessary monitoring to track the accuracy of those models? Then you assess that accuracy, then you improve the model, particularly along the time and space scales, and go back to the managers and saying, are you getting what you need? If not, what do you need? And so that's sort of the basic concept of how this process works. And so there's a role for the managers and stakeholders, and then there's a role for the scientists. And I think both of those neither can be done independently. They are very tightly connected. So the next slide. So what I'm suggesting is we pick a handful of topics and explore it through these processes. Now, I put up some potential topics here. Harmful algal blooms as something we might want to predict. The water supply is another one. The effects on Delta communities. What I mean on that is sort of the social and economic drivers or consequences of ecosystem change. So that's more the social economic kinds of things, fisheries, human activities, variety of things like that. Certainly fish recruitment and production relative to ESA and a variety of other aspects. And then also think about emerging issues that might come out of this and surprises. Now, in order to make forecasts of any one of these, they are all functions of climate, they're functions of estuary flows, every one of them, land use, restoration effort, and extreme events or hazards, such as fires, floods, levee failures, and human activities. All of those things impact those to a certain degree, and it's up to, when one talks about the science of making a forecast, the criteria is to look at how much of an impact these things have on it. Now, I didn't make these 5 up. These 5 come right out of the scientific needs assessment. Scientific needs assessment, we specifically pointed, and this is through those 4 discussions and a workshop. Harmful algal blooms came out as one of the top things. Water supply, forecasting came out as a top recommendation, but the types of things that we wanted to be able to forecast and identified as management themes are harmful algal blooms, water supply, effect on delta communities, and fish recruitment and production. I think we also suggested invasives. I did not put invasives on here because we just completed a review on that. And then we also suggested that managers need to look at, we as a board need to look at emerging issues, and managers and science in general needs to be prepared for those surprises. I don't know how you predict or forecast a surprise, but I put those in here for those other reasons. So how would this work if we're going to put together a series of meetings? And what I'm proposing is we run our board meetings. We have 2 meetings a month. The first board meeting is a traditional board meeting where we talk about our reviews and information items and so forth. And the second board meeting focus in on this process, looking at future science. So next slide. So what that would be is that we would hold 2 meetings on each of these topics. So it would be, for example, the second meeting in February and the second meeting in March would be on one of the topics. The second meeting in April and second meeting in May be on the other. The first one of those meetings is we would invite state and federal agencies and stakeholders to talk about their strategic management and science priorities. What are they planning relative to this issue? And the second part of the meeting would be talk about the science and what is really needed to put their usable forecast together. And let me explain that a little bit more. The next slide. So on the first meeting, just as an example, we can have an overview presentation on the topic. If we think about water and water flow, we could have somebody give a presentation, someone like Jay did, but where's the water? Where's it coming from? What are the big factors that influence the water flow in the system? You know, let's just get a full 1-hour informational background on this topic. And then have a panel of federal, state, and local stakeholders. For water, it might be the Bureau of Recreation. And I'm always thinking we have a federal and state, because everything that's done in the Delta in many respects has a state and federal component to it, and local. So you might have a Bureau of Reclamation Division, DWR, and water operators, and say, okay, now we know where water's going. What decisions do you actually need to make? And where are the decision points? And then secondly, what are your strategic science priorities in that context? What science do you plan to do in the future? Not necessarily what are you doing now, but what are you going to do in the future? What are you going to do in the future that's new in order to meet your foreseeable needs? So it's a forward-looking thing. And if we could give you a forecast and ask each of them, what forecast would be most beneficial to you? You want to know, when the next drought is? Do you want to know water level flows in over 1 week interval? Do you want to, what do you really need to know? And then finally, in general, how do you prepare for surprises and events? So I would propose this is a kind of approach. The first bullet really provides us with information that all the board members, and we get information on fishes and ESA things and water quality or quantity issues, things like that, information topic. And the second is really looking at management needs in the context of looking to the future, in the context of science. What is their science strategy? Where do they think they're going? What do they really need? And what's their highest forecast need? I don't think they think in terms of a forecast need. They might. I know there are some forecasts and water operators and statistical things like that. But what is their highest need? Something they don't have now that would really be valuable for them to improve their decision-making capabilities. Okay, and I think it was the last slide. So given that, where would we end up a year from now? One is I think we could have some syntheses done on these topics. An identification of clear interagency opportunities to meet stakeholder needs. I think we could produce a product, either one for each one or a series or one whole product. And I do see a role in here that our but postdoctoral scholars could take is, okay, let's say that they need in water, whatever, harmful algal blooms is the simplest for me to think, but let's say they need this sort of a forecast. Then they could be put, a postdoctoral scholar could be put on and say, well, let's do the literature of what is currently known about that in general, what's currently known about it in the Delta, and where are successful forecasts being made in this field. And a synthesis that includes identified management needs. And then that could be something that we could use with our input and our own discussions to make some recommendations on a pathway forward. It does provide us with an evaluation of strategic planning efforts and integration, because we'll be talking to the agencies about what are you planning to do and future looking, and that is something that is part of our actual requirements, is to look at strategic efforts. I think this also provides a way of exploring potential for thematic reviews. If you look at those 4 or 5 topics, each one of those comes out, and including ecological forecasting as a 5th one, comes out in that document of a review of potential review topics, themes. They all come out in there. We talk about the community driving forces. We've talked about certainly water supply and fish recruitment, and even ecological forecasting. We also talk about climate change and so forth, which comes into all of those. So I think this provides a good way to explore some of the potential for thematic review topics. And then finally, hopefully through this process, because we're looking forward, we might be able to identify emerging issues. So anyway, that's my case. And I'm happy to, let's open this up for general discussion. At the end of today, I would like to get a sense of the board, where they want to go on our option B alternatives, where they want to go in terms of beyond finishing our current reviews, how that might be structured. Is there a team of people who would like to take this on as the writing team, although in many respects it'll be a organizational thing to work with staff to identify the right people to come in and just to help put this together, but take the leadership on what questions we would ask our panelists and things like that. It'd be nice to have a 3-person team to take that over if we decide to go that route. So, and I'm happy to take any criticism too and alternative suggestions. I knew Jim was going to have his hand up first for some reason.
Sorry. I don't think it's surprising that, Steve, that you're proposing something that is looking forward, because I think in just about every one of our meetings, we've talked about the need for and importance of forward-looking science. And you laid all of the documents that make reference to this. So it's my understanding that the reviews that have been done historically by the ISB have been shaped by our individual interests. So you're proposing something that you're interested in, and I think that maybe has been the way things have worked in the past. And so I asked myself, based on the meetings that we've had today, what is something that I'm interested in, would be interested in doing to contribute to the ISB? And it's not surprising that it aligns pretty closely, I think, with what you're describing. It might be a precursor, it might be something that's going on in parallel, but could I just kind of describe a project that I think would be relevant for the ISB that aligns with your vision here for forecasting?
Sure.
So I'm I'm interested in model-based scenarios of the future, but maybe what I'm thinking about should include other modes of forward thinking, like horizon scanning. It's something I don't know anything about. And so I was imagining an effort of the ISB to do an inventory of forward-looking science in the Delta and the Bay. So I'm talking about an inventory. And the goal would be fact-finding to learn about, first of all, what scenarios have been developed already, and there are a fair number. What scenarios are in process, are being developed right now, and what scenarios are being planned. I saw a draft proposal for the Delta Science Program's call for new projects that is a forward-looking research project. So one of the steps that we could take to develop this inventory would be to have presentations from people who are involved in forward-looking, in scenario development. So I can imagine a dozen presentations that from people who are working on this right now. So I thought of 11 just off the top of my head. So let me read through these really quickly. And for each of these, I think that there is an agency or a person we could invite to give a presentation. So one example would be what work has been done on adaptations to sea level rise in the Bay Area. And the degree to which we're hardening the boundaries of the Bay is going to have an effect on the tidal prism. It's going to have effect on the tides in the Delta and salinity intrusion. So I think it would be within our domain to learn about plans for adaptation to sea level rise in the Bay Area, because they're going to have upstream effects. Another would be the future of tidal marshes in the face of both sea level rise and reduced sediment input. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and maybe we're now in the billion-dollar range of restoring tidal marshes around the Bay. There have been scenarios of what the futures of those tidal marshes are, given the threats from both sea level rise and reduced sediment input to the estuary. What's been done in terms of scenarios of levee failure and their consequences for the Delta, both people and the ecosystem. Certainly people have been working on scenarios of levee failure. There's a high probability that this is going to happen. I'd love to hear a presentation on what kind of scenarios have been developed. What about the effects of the combination of warming and flow modifications on harmful algal blooms? We know that temperature and residence time are big regulators of HAB dynamics. What thinking has been done in terms of scenarios of HABs increasing or decreasing in the future as a result of water management and warming? What about the expected outcomes of habitat restoration? The state of California has grand plans for restoring different types of habitats. How much thought and scenario development has been put into the question of what are we expecting the outcomes of habitat restoration to be? We've talked already about invasive species scenarios, which have been developed, to which extent. What are the consequences of altered precipitation, snow melt, adaptations of water management to seasonal flows and salinity, and what are the consequences of changing hydroclimatology for the Delta? What about threats of warming to native fishes? I know that Larry Brown has published a paper, and I think the theme of that paper was that as the Delta continues to warm, that's going to favor some of the non-native species as opposed to the natives. What about plausible scenarios of changing ocean conditions and their effects on sustainability of California's salmon populations? What about the effects of continued changes in sediment input and turbidity? The Delta and the Bay are much clearer, have much smaller sediment inputs now than they did 50 years ago. What are the implications for that for the future? What about the consequences of continued population growth in California? So I can imagine a series of invited presentations along the lines of the presentations that we've had in the last few meetings. And I think this kind of aligns to some extent, Steve, with what you're proposing, which is different in the sense that what you're proposing is something that's operational. You're talking about forecasting. And while this is going on, we also have to put effort into finding and reading reports that include scenarios in the future Delta. So the product that I was imagining would be a synthesis report or paper that, number one, defines the current and anticipated near-term state of forward-looking science and its implications, and two, gaps in efforts towards anticipation of change. So I think one of the important outcomes of this would be identifying important areas where scenarios are not being developed, haven't been developed. So, and I think this aligns, Steve, with your effort towards forecasting. I can imagine that this could end in a special session at the next Bay Delta Science Conference. It can include a set of recommendations. And certainly we need to involve the decision makers in this process. So bottom line here, I think, Steve, you and I are thinking along very similar lines. I'm not thinking operationally. I'm thinking about something that I think is simpler, and that is an inventory of where we stand and what are the important gaps.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, I totally agree with you. I think we're basically saying the same thing with different words. And I know when people think of the word forecasting, and it is always has the connotation of operational, which is not, which is a whole different thing. You know, one could use the word prediction, you know, things like that. And scenario development is scenario development, horizon scanning, those kinds of things are exactly the same kind of things I think we would be discussing. And maybe it's a matter of just altering the questions we ask the managers and the presentations that we have given. And scenario development, in some respects, one could argue, you know, is a scenario, okay, the water, sea level is going to rise, so therefore what's the impact, you know, on X? Or the other way to look at it is, say, if I want to know what's going to happen in X in 10 years, I need to consider sea level rise and this and that and that. So I think it's just two ways of asking the same question. You know, do you develop you look at the driving force and its potential impacts, or do you look at the product you're looking at, which might be fish production, and what are the driving forces that impact it? But I think, and so the question I would have is, when you say scenario development, and I do have a list of the things you suggested with people, is there a need for looking at, initially at something like just have some general talks given about, you know, scenario development, horizon scanning, dynamic planning, and someone to define those various approaches right up front? Is that a valuable thing to do? I think Laurel's talked a little bit about that. Jim?
Well, I don't know enough about these other modes to say anything about this subject. I have a pretty good understanding of what we mean by scenarios, and oftentimes scenarios are built from model simulations. And so scenarios answer the what if question. What if the planet warms at this rate? What are the implications? So that's what I mean by scenarios. But, you know, I quickly read the draft document that you all are putting together about forward-looking science, and you mentioned two other modes of forward-looking science. And I don't think that we should constrain ourselves to scenario building. So the question then should be an inventory of what has been done to apply any different mode of forward-looking science to the Bay and the Delta. I don't think that we should restrict it to scenarios.
So I want to ask a question. Jim, your ideas are interesting, and I'm wondering if the product you're thinking of is something like the IPCC developed that was a cluster of future changes that were all realistic under some conditions, that allowed then the science to think about how those cluster of changes, so population growth, climate change, erosion, all these different things. If there was a realistic cluster within a scenario or a set of scenarios that then allow management ideas to be considered. And in both of these proposals, I think recommendations for management is important. You mentioned that a little bit, Steve, but I think what the science needs to do is not just come out with model results, but recommendations for management or modeling or monitoring that then can change the way decisions are made.
Virginia, I think the ultimate product would be something like the IPCC reports, but I think before we start thinking about that, we need to do something even more basic and fundamental and simple, and that is just an inventory. What's been done? What do we know? So I'm thinking at a smaller scale right now.
So let me ask Jim one question and we'll go to Diane. In terms of the inventory, does someone need to do a literature review?
I think that should be part of this, yeah. And, so I can imagine a postdoc working on this as long as the postdoc's going to get a good paper out of this.
Diane?
So I was wondering about a timeline with respect to 2022 when we're going to get some report related to the conveyance project. And that seems to be like an elephant in the room here because that sets a timeline in terms of whether, will these scenarios that might be considered, are they addressing we have the certainty to some extent of sea level rise. We have the uncertainty of this conveyance project. Do we need to do a synthesis?
We lost you.
What?
Okay.
Do we need to do a synthesis on or address the hazardous algal blooms in the context of the possibility of the conveyance project, which could potentially exacerbate the situation? I just think that in terms of management needs, that's a pivotal point for us as a board, since we know at some point there will be a document for us to review.
I guess my response would be is that I think what we're talking about now is planning out our next basically 12 months. So we're not going to get that document until 2022. I think that by then we'll theoretically have these 4 current reviews completed. And if we do scenario planning or future looking in any respect and giving us a sense of what future needs might be in the context of a changing environment, I would think we would be in a pretty solid position to then have a review of that document, because we've talked about the future science scenarios and capabilities, and we've talked about a breadth of topics, and I do think we do need to talk about things like water quality and fish as an example of the co-equal goals and get really immersed in those. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't know if there's any other way we can jump ahead and prepare for that. I hesitate to do that because I'm not sure exactly what we're going to be asked to review.
I think Diane raises a good point about this Delta conveyance review coming in perhaps 2022. We only really have time to do 1 or 2 reviews, new reviews in this time frame, and these will be the first reviews that this group has done. So I would recommend that one of our considerations in choosing a topic and choosing how we do the review is looking at it as a training review, in a sense, for having us work together. That I think the sociology of how we do this next review is probably really important for the success of the next 20 reviews that we do, that this group does. And so I think that might have some bearing on the topic, but it certainly has some bearing on the method and approach and the organization that we take to that, whatever topic we choose.
Okay, Lisa?
Thanks. I think these are all great ideas, and I like the way Jim really focused on things that managers could use to to manage. But I had just a couple thoughts. One is related to this idea that there will be the system's constantly changing, and past events are not as good predictors of future events as they used to be. And so that has led people, and Jay knows I've been working on a review for NOAA on this, on just really rethinking how they make decisions and how they do forecasting to take uncertainty better into account. And the idea is that no matter how much time you spend making a projection, it's going to be wrong. And so the question is, how do you sort of bake that into the system that you're going to be wrong, but not have regret about what you chose based on the best available information at the time. And so there's these more dynamic ways of making decisions where you basically figure out, what do I need to do now to prevent harm, and what can I wait to invest in when I have more information about how the system is progressing. And it might be useful to think more about that as we're thinking about the current science, maybe to bring that home a bit more. In general, we're talking about probabilistic risk assessment, but then there's this side that's deep uncertainty that includes this horizon scanning aspect of, what am I not thinking of? What if the tails of the distribution turn out to be true, not the center of the distribution? Would that change the decision I make? Anyway, so it's something we could think about bringing more generally. And as part of that, maybe that's actually a big thing to really bring uncertainty into everyone's decision making. But a lesser thing that could be tackled in the short term is what information is already available to try to assess variability of the system that isn't being used? Because I don't know a lot yet about how things work in the Delta, but in general, I find this true around lots of state and federal agencies. They're not even really using their current information very well. And so I'm very curious as to how can we make the data and information more accessible to managers, because there's a barrier to entry. They don't have time to do lit reviews every time they need to know something. So I don't even know if they use our reviews. If they're like any other system I've worked with, they don't even thoroughly use reviews that are designed specifically for them. So I think there's a sociology aspect here of just how do we get people to really use information? What do those tools look like? So that's kind of an add-on to any direction we eventually go.
Yes, Tanya.
Thanks, Steve. These are all fantastic ideas, and kind of building off of Lisa's point there, I think one of the things, Steve, I liked about your presentation was this emphasis on bringing in managers, decision makers into our meetings, maybe one of our meetings a month, to kind of get their feedback on priorities for the topical issues or the scope maybe of what we want to kind of start with in terms of this year's effort. And I really like Jim's idea of doing an inventory, but I could imagine that inventory getting rather large, perhaps, and maybe we need some kind of interactive scoping process with the inventory where we're also asking some of those questions that Lisa just brought up around, what information, is out there that you don't have time to use, or what information do you wish you had at your fingertips that would be helping you with some of these kind of uncertainties and forward-looking issues. So I feel like there's some process questions here about how we develop this next product. And I like some of those process ideas you laid out, Steve, but I also think they could be integrated with the kind of inventory idea that Jim put out. And it seems feasible and manageable, but I would like a little bit of that kind of iteration between what do managers need and what are we seeing in the kind of published literature or the research, or what are scientists doing, a little back and forth.
So maybe one way to think about this, as I following up on Jim's comment, all your comments, is that, scenario planning in many respects is a forecasting tool, the way I would describe it. That's exactly what they're doing. They're just doing it in a less formalized operational modeling framework, because scenario planning is you propose this is going to change and you see what the potential happen might be. You're making a prediction. So if you buy that argument, then I think one could take these topics and let's go back to water and talk about instead of asking them what forecast, we could ask them what scenario planning and what have you run, and we could do the literature sort of evaluation and discussion, on that topic. Once we talk to the managers and they say, okay, we really need to know X, Y, and Z, or maybe that's already relevant. Okay, what sort of scenario planning has been done in that arena, as opposed to doing, scenario planning inventory on everything for the entire bay, to narrow it down into a small group of maybe 4 topics or something like that. And that way the inventory might be easier, and sort of the in-depth analysis of what's been done might be more manageable. And then we can bring in some of the stuff also that Lisa's talking about. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, in our previous reviews, always some are the focused on a particular topic, not just based on our interest. It was always consulted with the whole barrage of people around. And also we had a retreat time to time, almost yearly. And in that retreat, we discussed what type of topics which are immediate use. So maybe, just to synthesize between you and Jim, Steve, that you have these topics, broad topics based on the science needs assessment. And then within that broad topics, what are the granularized science issues we should be discussing and come up with? So some kind of a portfolio that we can go one by one, if it's that agreeable to the major decision makers and as well as managers.
Yeah, and just to remind folks again on the, as Joe said, we have had, we called them retreats. We sent out surveys to folks and say what kind of reviews we should do, and also had open public meetings to ask them what kind of topics are relevant. And then we also have had many discussions of it. Our latest is that July 30th document where we entitled Planning Future Science Reviews, which is based, I believe, and maybe Edmund can correct me if I'm wrong, but we did a more targeted survey last November that was targeted towards largely agency and science heads, and our own input, and put together this document, which does list a series sort of general topics. And again, no, those are not unusual. They're things like climate change and Delta is an evolving place, sort of the social economic drivers, water quality, water quantity, the standard kinds of things we've been talking about. But you can look at that, gives you a little bit more input. So anyway, and maybe as part of this process, we do again invite these state, local, federal people in, and ask them the questions about like future scenarios and stuff like that. Where are you getting what you need in that concept? Do you need other scenarios being built? And are you aware of scenario planning and things like that? Lisa?
Just a question for you. Are the kinds of things that you've heard from managers in the past, are they forward-looking? Is that a subset of managers who are looking more long-term, or is there a lot of managers looking long-term?
Well, in the science needs assessment, that was the focus of the entire discussion and workshop was to be, what are you looking at in the context of climate change? So it was really all designed to be that forward-looking stuff. I don't think we use those words at all in terms of Edmund, can you remember kind of what the questions were that we were asking folks?
Yes, let me read you the questions. Or actually, so the first question was, what are the most important and challenging, they are not necessarily the same, science issues you see in the coming years? What scientific themes would you like to see the Delta ISB review? So those were the 2 questions that were asked during the last survey.
And do we have a separate report for that survey?
Yes, I'm sharing it right here on the screen. It's linked to the planning future reviews document. So the two questions I read were right here. And then the list of responses that were provided are followed for each question.
Yeah, and if I recall going through these, climate change was in some way or form, Lisa, was a fairly recurrent theme, if I recall, in some form or another.
This is my social science bias, but I do find that sometimes people kind of don't have as much familiarity with social science just because it hasn't been as well integrated. And so in some cases, they don't know what to ask for in terms of really thinking through how behavior is going to evolve in response to climate change, for example, that can exacerbate and or mitigate, what happens in the natural system. So anyway, I guess I'm just cautioning that there's a balance in terms of asking them what science they think they need, but also just really understanding what problems they're trying to solve or what their concerns are, separate from what they think their science needs are, because it may be that we have other suggestions too. So just trying to keep that conversation open.
Yeah, and I think the audience for the survey is also an important aspect to it. And I know when there's been other surveys done by us and others, some have, we had 20 or 30 selected individuals here. In the past, we've just had it open. In some cases, I know that some other surveys that are being done in the Delta have hundreds of people, and they're stakeholders and individual farmers and so forth. And they all have, of course, a different perspective on, for example, what we would review, and probably a different level of interest on what we would review. So therefore, it's always a search for making sure we're not missing any big items, and then it has to be melded into our own evaluation of what the science needs are at the level of the way we look at things. We don't look at what happens with this particular restoration effort in this particular area, but we look at much bigger themes. Yes, Virginia.
So I strongly agree that it's important to ask these managers and decision makers what their issues are. As Lisa was said, not just what the science needs are, but we need to be aware that so many times these managers aren't really thinking outside of the box. I mean, who could have predicted we'd be in a pandemic now, and how that's affecting transportation, and that has great effects, I think, probably on the Bay system, what's going on now. I remember I was with a academy group looking at road development when we went to Seattle as a prime case of how well they developed roads. And I asked them, well, what are your plans for when Mount Rainier erupts? And they were flabbergasted, even though the airport's built on a mud flow from Mount Rainier. So people don't really think out of the box. So we can push them, to the ability we can to do that, but we just need to be aware of that.
And one more thought along these lines. Sorry if I'm taking too much floor time, but when I think about HABs, I think a lot about a model that's designed to quickly get people out of harm's way, like close off areas that have a bloom, are really different from the kind of model that Jim was talking about, where how do I manage land use so we have fewer blooms, right? Those probably are two completely different models. So I guess I also just want to, in whatever inventory or scenario planning we're doing, we really think about, what are we managing for? What decisions are we supporting? And I think you said this, but that one always sticks with me because I know those two models just tend to be so different.
I think that raises an important question for all of the sort of forecasting discussions and forward-looking, whatever it is. Often we have different timeframes for for different kinds of decisions. As Lisa mentioned, for operational decisions, public safety, decisions, we often have a short operational time frame, a span of even as short as hours if you're talking about Mount Rainier erupting to days, maybe a week or so in some kind of forecasting situations for harmful algal blooms, perhaps. In other infrastructure problems, we have infrastructure planning problems. We have maybe decadal several decades kind of forecasts, and for policies, maybe even longer. So I think if we talk about decision making and forecasting, we sort of have to have the operational time frame that's relevant that we have in mind for that kind of forecasting.
And Lisa, to follow up on you and Jay, and maybe that's an approach, you know, as we say, okay, you've got these, in essence, two different scales of needs. One is sort of what are you forecasting a harmful algal bloom days and weeks in advance to make a clear decision, versus the more scenario planning, which might be the longer term. What do I need to do in terms of changing land use patterns to affect the occurrences in general of harmful algal blooms? And that's not, they're not contradictory. And I think in many respects, it is a matter of time and space scales. And because I think I would argue that the process arrows that you're dealing with are pretty much the same. You know, whether you're forecasting it a day in advance or 10 years in advance, it's going to be affected by climate, meteorology, water flow, nutrient loading, nutrient status, you know, the biology and so forth, land use. And I think, and maybe that's, you know, one way we could approach some of this when we talk to managers. And that's, so what are your time and space scales for your needs? And then when we talk about the science of it, harmful algal blooms, and look forward looking, we can talk about both. Well, what if I was going to make a forecast? What would I need? You know, and I'm not talking about the details of the model itself. I'm talking about the framework of the model that has arrows and boxes pointing to different things, and versus a scenario planning. Are there something that would come into play in that? And maybe when you talk about scenario planning, you have a more consideration of surprises or episodic events and things like that are need to be taken.
Even for operational timeframes, you'll do scenario planning. I mean, you have to be, if you're running a water system in California, you have to be prepared for the scenario of a major earthquake happening any second now. I mean, so I think there's actually a lot of commonality in terms of the way you think about these kind of forecasts, but the details of how you do it and the decisions that you're targeting the forecasting to can be quite different.
I wanted to jump in on the possibility of addressing the harmful algal blooms in this framework of having meetings with the stakeholders to find out what they need, and then also what scenarios they're working on. It was pretty clear that there was a lot of public interest in that session. And if we had said, oh yeah, next week we'll have something where you tell us what your scenario, what you're doing and what you need, a lot of people would have been back. So that's one of the appeals of trying to do these together, is that and the harmful algal blooms kind of focusing or initial topic is we don't have to wonder if there's going to be engagement. And we just had seminars and they were there. And they wanted to tell us like what they needed if we had kept going.
Yeah, I think you'll get the same if you use the word fish too, but a whole different crowd. I'm biased. Joe, did I see your hand up?
No.
Well, I'm hearing a lot of great ideas, and I think there's some sort of consensus or maybe difference in the level of detail and the actual approach. Does anybody violently object to looking at sort of future science sort of as a theme for the way we approach our second option B? Oh, Tom's hands up.
Yeah, I'm not going to object violently, but one thought I did have as I listened to this is we're casting our net quite broadly here, and we are limited in the amount of time. And maybe we could be more targeted in what we do, take a specific topic. For example, sea level rise is, critical to just about everything in the Delta, but how to deal with the uncertainty of sea level rise is a big challenge for managers. when I looked at the review of the questionnaire for the water supply reliability, that was really that and climate change were their two big topics, but they didn't really have any sense of how to deal with it. We get these assessment reports that are almost like definitive answers, even though there's uncertainty with them. But how you manage through these kind of situations, just taking a specific example that's really important might be an easier thing than to cast the net broadly to include multiple topics.
Tom, has the climate adapts thing that the council is doing, do they address sea level rise at all, or?
Yeah.
Quantitatively or scenarios or?
Yeah, it's a scenario. Well, no, it's more probabilistic. You could call it sort of a scenario, but it's based on the recurrence of the 100-year flood being more frequent. And I'd also like to make a point about this distinction between sort of prediction and forecasting. I know in my discipline, in seismology and earthquakes, we went through a period where we really came to grips with that problem. And we make a very strong distinction between a prediction, which is a very specific type of forecast, and then forecast, which is in a broader sense, more probabilistic. And I suspect a lot of the other disciplines have had to deal with that issue as well, certainly in water. I mean, there's a big difference between a flood fight and a trying to design a system for a drought. And so I think there's a lot to be learned there. I'm just not that familiar with the other disciplines that I could give you a laundry list of who's thought through that. But certainly in the earthquake business, we've thought through it a lot, and it has implications for how you solve the problem.
Yeah, and I've, of course, and Lisa is reviewing stuff on this right now in terms of forecasting. And yeah, those words trigger different things in different people. Federal agencies, and I'm going to generalize, having been in a federal agency for 10 years, 12 years, forecasting has a very specific meaning, and it comes with a specific liabilities and accuracy, and it's determined as a product. Water level forecast, weather forecast, hurricane forecast, and I'm speaking from NOAA in particular, and it comes with a certain level of responsibility and baggage in that regard. And I'm not proposing that. When I talk about forecasting, I talk about something that's more rigorous than along the lines of what we might think of scientifically predicting. I can't think of a scientific paper, or many scientific papers make predictions. My data show if this, then that might happen. That's a prediction. And I think that my data show those sorts of things. Those are all kind of very, very non-rigorous predictions in many respects. So I think we can get bogged down in trying to define what it is. But the idea is that you come up with the prediction of what you want to predict is the thing that determines how you structure your activity, as opposed to of the impact of a different force. So, for example, if I'm trying to look at like a harmful algal blooms, the example again, if I want to try and forecast, predict, or determine what the harmful algal bloom is going to be, it requires me to look at all the forces that might impact that in the time and space scales. That's different than looking at the impact of a change in meteorology on the delta, change in rainfall, severity of rainfall events. There's going to be, you're looking at the forcing factor, climate change, levee break, or so forth, and what its various impacts might be. There are multiple impacts. Or you might look at a change in a levee failure on fish production, or harmful algal blooms. It's a bilateral kind of approach. It's just a different way of thinking about how one goes about doing the science, and as opposed to perhaps my oversell of what the actual product would be in the end. It's the way you format your research agenda. I know that was very confusing. Yes, go ahead, Virginia.
So I wanted to agree with Tom's idea to take one problem and develop the themes and the ideas around this. And that also supports Jay's idea that as we go through this process, it will be a training ground, so to speak, for us to figure out how to work together. And some of these ideas have been useful, but there's so much going on in the Bay, we can't do it all. My team has developed an approach for doing these kinds of things. And our first step is to define the scope, which ends, what problem you're addressing and what's the context, and that's the scales of what you're doing. And then it ends with recommending the best practices for whatever the problem is, and it involves models and data. So I'll send it around, and it may or may not be useful for kind of figuring out an approach, because I think we can take on one of these problems and see how we work together and work with the agencies and the programs that are out there, because we need to consider them as all the stakeholders as part of our team, so to speak.
Virginia, I had the exact same reaction as this discussion is unfolding, and I think Jay's advice is really sound. Let's use this as a testing ground. Let's not go full bore here. I like the idea of focusing in on a specific problem, and let's use this as a testing ground, but at the same time, hope that we produce something that's useful.
What might be interesting, we kind of need the orphan problem that no one's already digging in too heavily on. And maybe if someone knew, like Jim, that there were data and scenarios being developed that weren't really getting used in management, maybe that could be a way we could contribute in terms of thinking through not only what's been done, but how to make it more usable.
Well, I can give you an example. I don't know if you all know about the USGS Cascade project. It started maybe 2 decades ago. And it's a project that is forward-looking, and it links different kinds of models. It links global circulation models with watershed models, with hydrodynamic models of the Delta and the Bay, and oceanic forcing as tides, tidal changes in tidal forcing. And it used the linkages of these different models to answer some specific questions about things like how might precipitation in the Sierras change over time as a consequence of global warming? What will it mean in terms of quantity of precipitation, runoff, the seasonal timing of that, coupled with different rates of sea level rise, the effects downstream of changing sediment inputs to the Delta. So this is a project that has 2 phases. The first phase ended with a paper that we published in 2011 that kind of laid out the hydroclimatic scenarios under 2 different global warming scenarios, and then the downstream effects in the Delta and in the Bay. And then the second phase is still ongoing. This is a project that was designed to answer the question, what might climate change mean for the Delta and the Bay? I don't know what impact, if any, that science has had on decisions.
So Jim, when you say that, what it might mean for the Bay, is the output water, or do they go up to fish? Do they go up to economics? Do they go, what's the, or contaminant level?
No, the primary metrics are inflow to the Delta and the Bay, seasonal timing and quantity, sediment delivery and sediment concentrations and turbidity. Actually, I think the latest version has a sediment transport model linked to it. So sediment dynamics in the Delta and the Bay. Temperature is an important part of it. Temperature in the rivers, in the estuary, and in the Bay. I'm trying to think what else. And there was a plan to couple a phytoplankton dynamics model to this. I know that it's in process. I don't know what state it's in right now. I mean, it's something that we should find out. But in terms of Lisa's, I think it was Lisa who posed the question, can we find an example of and we described this as these results as scenarios. You know, these are projections of what might happen given this change in global forcing. And it was done by the motivation was that people who have these really difficult decision-making jobs should be given information about how the future might unfold. And I honestly don't know the extent to which these results have been applied.
Joe.
Yeah, I remember that. Is that, Jim, is that Dettinger? Is that project?
Well, Mike is certainly part of it, but...
Okay, and we had him give a talk when we were doing the levee failure, the review. We had him, and I thought it was a very interesting talk because they basically were taking the whole climate change scenarios, all those grids, and downscale into delta scale. So
Right.
after that, I don't think we pursued this, but I thought it was an excellent way to go.
And the hydrodynamic modeling is being done by Lisa Lucas and...
Yeah, she also spoke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Diane?
It seems like this effort that Jim described is very relevant to the hazardous algal blooms issue because the timing of the flows and the warming temperatures, and if there's a phytoplankton model underway, this could be what's needed to think about the hazardous algal bloom and issue on the longer term time frame, maybe not the how do you close this marina tomorrow, but I think that could be a good context for thinking about the potential use.
Well, maybe it seems if we want to do a trial balloon, so to speak, and include the scenario planning and what's out there, as Diane and others have said, that HAB seems to be an issue. We've already started a little bit. It's one of the recommendations in our science needs assessment. It does tend to tie things together, and maybe we could try some approach where we start the process, in the way that's in a variety of ways that have been discussed here. We include certainly the social science component of it, examine what scenarios are applicable to HABs or what scenario development have been done with HABs, talk to managers in their time scales, what do they need shorthand, long time, what are they thinking about, and ask all the questions we've been asking, run it through the next couple of meetings and see if we are, and then do another reassessment. The next couple of meetings will be the one in February and the one in March. So it'll be a couple of months down the road, and then have another discussion and say, okay, is this something we want to pursue continuously and write a review on? Or is this something that, well, we've had enough of this and let's move on to something more important like fish, or we can, or, and have a reassessment in a couple of months. Does that seem like a reasonable approach to get started? I'm seeing a lot of head noddings. Jim, are you all right with that?
Could I just add, I think Diane had a specific flavor though, in terms of saying like, okay, you could ask what data and scenarios are available to understand HABs better. And that's how you phrased it. And that's great. I think that's really good. But I liked this idea that, this model's available that's been thinking about a range of future possibilities. How would you actually use that information to improve your decisions? Like, I want to keep that flavor because to me, that's really interesting.
Yeah, because we could start out informing not just ourselves, but the stakeholders about this the structure of the model. We can be a filter, but yeah, that was one of my ideas, and we would know they would show up.
I think
how
it sounds
about
like a
if
really
I-
good topic. One idea in terms of how we approach it might be to think about, is there a small piece of that topic that we could produce as a short, on a relatively short timeline to get us into it, and to produce a small product before we would do a larger product. And it would help, I think, prime interest in the topic and in our second report as well.
Would that be something like the inventory that Jim was talking about, but more narrow, like a lit review that we could?
Yeah, I think something that sort of lays out the problem. And, in other kinds of topics, we've had sort of a myth busting sort of a piece where you sort of lay out the problem and say, well, here are some misconceptions about the topic that you want to sort of deal with before you get into a more serious review.
Tom?
Yeah, coming back to the terminology we use in seismology with prediction, forecasting, and scenarios. I could very easily define them in terms of earthquakes, and just thinking of the HABs, that might be a good way to frame the question. What is the state of knowledge for each one of those? Because the prediction is a very specific thing, the forecast is a very broad thing, and then the scenario is just a figment of your imagination. But it would be a way of capturing the science, I think, in a useful way.
Yeah, I like that idea. All right, what I'd like to recommend then, is we form a small, what we'll call writing team or small group. I think writing team is the one that's allowed to take charge and carry this forward. And that would be to figure out how, a process of who you might invite in to give a seminar, what agency folks the staff will certainly be happy to provide a lot of ideas on that. The questions we might ask them, following up with Tom's ideas, making sure we cover the stage and let them take charge of that over the next few months and go from there. And I would I'm going to suggest Jim and Virginia and Lisa as not having anything currently assigned to them, and because they spoke up, and ask maybe Diane wants to join in too. She's looking like she might. Anybody? You guys?
Yeah, I would like to wait. We'll be briefed about what's ahead for the monitoring team, but I would like to be involved with respect to HABs, but I can't. I need to learn more about what the monitoring project. Yeah, so Edmund's going to schedule a meeting for us, right, Edmund?
That's correct.
Okay.
Jim, Virginia, Lisa, any thoughts on whether or not you want to jump in on this for it's only a two or so month commitment at this stage to help us get these first series of meetings going on HABs.
So I'd be glad to jump in with the understanding I know so little about the Delta system, and so rely on others who are more familiar with it to make the pie in the sky ideas kind of relate to reality, because if we don't do that, there's no point in doing it.
Yeah, I'm also very willing to step in with the same caveat. And I know Diane has already started down this road. So, I really hope Diane can be involved without putting too much on her. So I know a little enough about HABs to be dangerous probably. So, but I think more generally, I'd like to focus on the decision science aspects of it. And so, I'm seeing like some conceptual models, because, a lot of people just think uncertainty analysis is for eggheads as opposed to really usable in management. And so that's what I want to get past that.
So Jim, you want to jump in? Seems like you have pretty good knowledge on some of this stuff, the cascades and stuff.
I'm sorry, I just took a little break there. I missed the last 2 minutes.
While you were gone, we've put together a sort of writing team to take the lead on doing the HABs kind of.
This is why it's dangerous to take a break.
And you were unanimously selected to be part of this team. And
In the lead.
what's that? Yeah, you should. That's a very important lesson to learn. Never leave. And with Lisa in Virginia, with some aid from Diane, to, in essence, put together the what we've been talking about for sort of a first crack at the HABs sort of scenario. And I don't know if Tom suggested maybe to talk about looking at asking questions related to both prediction, forecasting, and scenario, and put together what we think we need to have for the first for the next 2 months, which is really just two meetings. And then we'll see where we are at the end of that to see if we want to continue along this path, whether we want to toss it for another subject, and see how far we get on the whole scale of this future thinking stuff.
So what exactly did you sign me up to do?
To be for you and Lisa and Virginia to be what we're calling the writing team, but the team that puts it together for the next few months along this topic.
Okay, and what does puts it together mean? So this is part of the theme of forward-looking science, right?
Yeah, it's a theme of forward-looking. It's a harmful algal bloom focus, following along all of the discussions we've had, and bringing in someone to talk about the subject, someone to some managers to talk about their interest in forecasting, prediction, scenario development, bring in people that maybe might talk about cascades or something that you think is a good background in terms of the scenario development, and just really flush out this forward-looking topic for over the next couple of meetings. And you're wide open as to exactly how you design it or who you bring in, and of course, you know, and just sort of along the general theme we've been talking about.
So what do the rules say about us meeting offline? I mean, can Lisa and Virginia and I, can the three of us have a meeting?
The three of you can meet whenever you want, however you want, at any time. And you can send emails between each other. You're considered a writing team. There basically are no rules. Just don't distribute it in a group mail to any more than 5, but the three of you can do it. Edmund will certainly be helpful to set up conference calls and run doodle polls and help contact people and help identify people, things like that. Edmund is also at your disposal.
So
yeah, we can. Yes.
So Lisa and Virginia, how about the next step? We ask Edmund to find a time where the three of us can spend an hour together on a Zoom call. And Diane, if you could join us, would you like to?
Yeah, I would like to. I'm teaching Monday, Wednesday, Friday afternoon, so I don't want to limit people being able to get together quickly because I'm also on this other writing team, but I'd like to be included, and if I can join, depending on everybody else's schedule, I'd be glad to. Okay.
I don't know if we can get something up and running, you know, in the next 6 weeks. You know, people are busy and blah, blah, blah. So I don't know how soon we can get the first event scheduled, but we'll talk about that in our first discussion.
Yeah, do what you can, and that's the way we work. So,
I mean, I think one of the things that we could, well, I'll talk to Lisa and Virginia about this, but one of the things I think we probably could arrange within our next 3 meetings is just to give a presentation on this project, on this big project. And then where they stand in terms of linking HAB bloom dynamics into these models. But beyond that, I mean, I don't even know what the appropriate agencies are to draw into this. And so we need some advice on this. So people like Karen and Chelsea and Cheryl, we need your advice on what agencies and what individuals we should be drawing into this. I could imagine that we could have a couple of presentations from the appropriate state or federal agencies who are concerned about HABs and dealing with it at one level or another. I can tell Lisa that, and you might be surprised by this, I don't think there is much thought given to anything close to what it would take to establish a TMDL for the Delta. I just don't think that question has been addressed. And I think that will be one of the things that will come out of this little working group.
Yeah, I think our HABS discussion, there was a lot of interest in it, of course, and I think even with the science needs assessment, folks, Jay, there were a few folks that were really interested in the HABS, and so yeah, Jay can also probably throw you a name or two as well.
Okay.
To get started. So
yeah, any advice we can get about who we should contact?
I would get somebody from the urban water supply side, either Contra Costa Water District or Metropolitan, because they'll be thinking about this. And it's kind of nice to link. HABS is a nice topic because it covers ecosystem health, it covers in Delta recreation and those kinds of things, as well as water supply, particularly on the urban side.
So somebody like Deanne Serrano or?
Yes, she'd be great. She'd be a good point of contact.
And this is Laurel on the phone. I have an internet outage here, so I've been on the phone. But I would also suggest Brian Bergamaschi at USGS, because he's been moving towards providing near real-time images of HABS blooms within the Delta, so spatial information.
yeah, and the one piece of advice that I would give, and this is partly from, is to make sure we look at both federal, state, and local issues on these topics. So try and get someone from each of those basic management kind of areas.
Okay, we really need advice on this. And Deanna, for sure, at Contra Costa Water District, for sure, I'll contact her. So that would be regional, I guess.
And Jim,
Well,
when you do have your meeting, just keep staff in the loop, and we'll continue to support. We can send at least one of our staff people to your Zoom meeting where you talk more about this, so that we can keep supporting you with ideas.
Okay, so Edmund, can you include them in this doodle poll?
Yes, for the staff briefing, we'll organize it so there's an expert on that who could provide some input as well.
Well, that's terrific. We have a major accomplishment in that Jim has learned never to leave the room again. And,
I know this.
you're so experienced, I can't believe you did it, but that'll teach you. And I do appreciate you all volunteering. That was my major hope for today, that we'd end up with someone who would take charge of this and carry it forward, because that's the way we normally do business. And I appreciate you all, in quotes, volunteering. So I'm looking forward to it. This should be, I think this should be a fun topic. And any other thoughts on this and advice before we sort of wrap up? I have a couple little other little things, and we can wrap up for today. Yes, Tanya?
Quick question. Do we know when we might have postdocs available? Because it seems like having one of those postdocs assigned to this team to assist if there were some sort of literature review that needed to be done or inventory type thing, that might be helpful.
Not exactly. The status right now is that I am putting together in essence, job descriptions, but responsibilities. And we have to be sure that these are sort of above and beyond what normally is done by the council. And basically they're working, the argument is that they're working doing Delta Science board member activities and putting those together. And then we will have a discussion to evaluate which entity is the best one to go through in terms of letting a contract. Then there'll be a contract let at some stage, and that's the unknown time frame. I don't know how long that takes. And then there's a search process. I believe in both cases, the search, because it's at a scholar level, if we can identify individuals and stuff like that, we can get them appointed much more quickly than going through a really expanded search, because it's more of a scholar rather than a research associate postdoc. So if you have anybody that you think might be appropriate for this, by all means, let me know. So I don't know. I'm optimistically a couple of months, pessimistically double that. So
Yeah, I think
realistically triple it. And
I think Steve nailed it. That's, we need to have a scope so we can start writing a contract, and a couple more decisions before we can start writing that contract. And typically takes us a couple of months to execute a contract.
okay,
That
well,
said, in the interim, we can provide some staff support still for, basic support services, literature reviews, and organizing meetings, and helping to make connections to other people working in the system that might be relevant to talk to.
yeah, and for the writing team or any writing team, don't be afraid to ask. You need help, just I would guess work it through Edmund, and he can talk to folks and see what they can do to help. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I guess I need to ask if there's any public comment on this topic, Edmund.
There are none, but we do have a general public comment at the end.
Okay. Move on to item number 3, which is the preparation for upcoming Delta ISB meetings. We have the February 11th meeting scheduled. And again, as we're thinking about now, we will have one meeting a month that is more talking about our reviews and doing information item and logistics and whatever. And the second meeting be sort of this exploratory future idea. We don't have to do them 1 and 2. We can do 2 and 1, but right now, February 11th, we're tentatively have scheduled out a report out on the Adaptive Management Forum. We're planning to get a presentation by Harriet Ross, who's the Assistant Deputy Director for Planning on the Delta Adapts. And I think that's very relevant to what we're talking about now. We'll talk about what the council has already been thinking about along those lines. We will have a discussion of the science needs assessment and also a discussion of the water supply reliability review. And then I believe the February 23rd meeting will be the agenda will be decided by the writing team we just talked about. And that's it for upcoming meetings. Any comments on that?
Just a word of encouragement to everyone to take a look at the internal draft of the water supply reliability estimation review. We're really interested in your comments and thoughts, particularly how well this topic, this write-up on this sort of obscure topic communicates with a very diverse board.
Okay, any public comments on that one?
There are none.
And Edmund, do we have any follow-ups? Item 4?
Yeah, the main follow-ups have been covered already. So I'll be scheduling a staff briefing with those who will be drafting a proposal for forward-looking science and harmful algal blooms and how to move forward with a panel discussion or products that can come out of it to help explore that topic. And then Jay mentioned our other one is that at our February 11th meeting, there will be a water supply reliability discussion and for folks to review the water supply reliability outline before then and provide comments. We'll summarize once again in email, but those are the 2 main follow-up items from this meeting.
Okay.
There's actually one more on my list. It's actually not a group one, but more of a Virginia one. I think you said you may have some useful documents on how to narrow a scope of a topic. I'm not sure if that's something you would like us to circulate, but that's an item that was also on my list.
Okay, move on to item number 5, which is public comments for matters that are not on the agenda, but within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Delta. And I believe we have one public comment, Edmund.
Yes, this is from Rachel Klopfenstein. It's on the science needs assessment and also work planning. Rachel Klopfenstein is a senior environmental scientist with the Delta Science program. Her comment reads, the Delta Science program recently released a list of 65 top management questions developed as part of the update to the 2022 to 2026 Science Action Agenda. The questions developed with tremendous engagement from region managers, scientists, stakeholders, span multiple management themes, and may be highly relevant to the Delta ISB's proposed work regarding the science needs assessment and approach to seek stakeholder input on strategic management and scientific priorities. More information is available online at scienceactionagenda.deltacouncil.ca.gov or via email at saa@deltacouncil.ca.gov. We'll send the attachments included in this public comment for the ISB's consideration as you guys move forward with a proposal on forward-looking science topics.
Thanks, Edmund, and thanks, Rachel, for that. Maybe this is something one of us should look at, or all of us in particular, to see if there's anything related to harmful algal blooms on their recommendations that came out of that assessment, and possibly scoping out other possible reviews. We will be asked to review that document sometime this fall. Okay, well, I don't have anything else, so thanks everybody for their attention, and I had a lot of fun today. So I think we accomplished a lot and made some progress. So stay safe, and we'll officially adjourn.
Thank you all.
And thanks, Steve, for laying out that great vision that helped us make such good progress.
Thank you all.
Yeah, it's really exciting to hear this, and I look forward to working with you guys moving forward.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Edmund, are you there?